When I first heard he was being accused of murder, I didn't believe it. I knew this man, or at least I thought I did. His laughter, his scent, his fears. By the time the police came to his house, I had already hidden the knife. Not because he asked me to, because I decided that if truth could kill, then a lie might save. Now, years later, I understand. I didn't bury the evidence. I buried myself. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Haley Morgan. I was 32 years old and worked as a registered nurse in a community health clinic on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. My days began before sunrise and ended long after the sky had turned the color of ashes. My apartment was small but clean, the kind of place where silence became a roommate. I lived alone, not out of preference, but out of quiet resignation. People often mistook my solitude for strength, a choice born of independence. But the truth was simpler. I had learned too early that letting people in often meant letting pain in with them. The clinic where I worked was nothing like the glossy medical centers you see on TV. Ours was the kind of place people went when they had no other options. Low-income families, undocumented immigrants, women with children clinging to their legs, men who hadn't seen a doctor in years. It smelled like antiseptic and old linoleum, and the lights always buzzed faintly, like they were whispering secrets to each other. Still, it was mine. I took pride in the small victories. Catching a diagnosis early, calming a child during a vaccination, talking an elderly man out of skipping his insulin again. I was good at what I did, efficient, precise, calm under pressure. I had learned to keep my emotions in check, to not let the chaos of other people's lives spill into mine. The walls I had built weren't just professional, they were survival. I knew where to place my empathy, and more importantly, where not to. Some of the younger nurses called me cold behind my back. I wasn't. I just didn't bleed where people could see. When I got home, I had routines, rituals, really. I poured exactly one glass of wine, turned on the same jazz station, and stood in the kitchen while it played. I rarely finished the wine. I just liked the idea of it, the way the glass caught the dim light. I never left dirty dishes in the sink. I made my bed every morning. My refrigerator was organized by category and color. My closet was divided by season. There was comfort in control, even if the rest of the world felt unpredictable. My mother called every Thursday at 8 p.m. sharp. She lived 3 hours away and still asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, seeing anyone. I lied to her gently, the way daughters often do. I told her I was fine. She told me to get some rest. We danced that dance every week. I wasn't seeing anyone, not really. I had tried here and there, but nothing lasted. They always wanted more than I could give, more access, more vulnerability, more of me. And I was tired of being the one who unraveled. So I stayed busy instead. I volunteered on weekends. I ran 3 miles every other morning. I read crime thrillers before bed, drawn to stories where someone always figured it out, where justice arrived, even if late. It made sense to me. Life rarely did. There was a part of me that clung to the past, like an old faded photograph tucked into the back of a drawer. College years blurred by, the faces of people I once loved or almost loved, and one name lingered more than the others: Jason. We had met in pre-med. He was wild and brilliant, the kind of man who set off alarms in all the right ways. He didn't become a doctor. He dropped out before finals and disappeared into a haze of half-formed dreams and reckless choices. I stayed the course. I always did. That's who I was. Sometimes I thought about him, late at night during storms, when the thunder rattled the windows and the world felt thinner somehow. I wondered where he ended up, what kind of man he became, if he still remembered me, if he ever looked back. The truth was, I had built a life that worked. It wasn't thrilling or romantic, but it was safe. It was a life without sharp edges, without unexpected turns. And that's how I liked it. I thought I had outrun the chaos, outrun the mistakes, outrun whatever darkness lived in the corners of other people's lives. I thought I had found clarity, carved out a version of the world that was neat and knowable. But the thing about truth is that it doesn't vanish. It waits. It hides beneath the floorboards, behind the familiar, inside the faces of people you thought you'd left behind. It waits until the walls you built start to crack, until the person you were trying to forget shows up at your door, and suddenly, the life you worked so hard to keep clean begins to unravel in your hands. That morning, I woke up like I always did. I brushed my teeth, tied my hair into a tight bun, checked my schedule on my phone. I walked to my car with a travel mug of coffee and the radio playing softly. The sun was barely up, the air cool and expectant. Nothing felt different. The world spun as it always had. I didn't know that within a week, everything I believed about myself, my principles, my past, my sense of what was right, would be tested. I didn't know that truth would become something I'd bury with my own hands, or that the life I thought was mine was only a prologue to a story I wasn't ready to tell. But I felt something shift that day. A quiet tremor in the chest, a small, persistent pressure behind the eyes, the kind of feeling you ignore because it's easier not to ask why. Back then, I still thought I was the kind of woman who always did the right thing. I had no idea what I was capable of. It started with a knock at my door, not frantic, not urgent, just firm, controlled, a knock that knew it would be answered. I opened it without hesitation, without checking the peephole. That's how ordinary the moment felt. But there was nothing ordinary about the man who stood on the other side. Jason. His name didn't come to me instantly. It rose slowly, like smoke from a long-doused fire. His face was leaner than I remembered, sharper, harder. His eyes were the same, gray-blue, like weathered steel, but they no longer held the wild brightness of youth. Now they held something else, something heavy, something hunted. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I stepped back, and he stepped in. His clothes were damp, his shoes leaving dark smudges on the tile. He moved like a man who had been running for too long. I saw it all at once, in flashes, his trembling hands, the dark flecks on his shirt, the way he avoided looking directly at me. I knew before he said a word. Something had happened, something bad. There was blood, not a lot, but enough. I noticed it on the cuff of his sleeve, smeared into the edge of his collar. He sat on my couch like it belonged to someone else. I stood still, waiting for a story I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. And when it came, fragmented, panicked, contradictory, I didn't listen with the ears of a nurse or a woman or even a friend. I listened like someone who had already made a decision, without knowing exactly what it was. He told me it wasn't his fault, that he was scared, that it had been an accident, that the man had attacked him, that he hadn't meant to do it. But even through the fog of his words, I understood what he didn't say. Someone was dead, and Jason had been there when it happened. I should have told him to go to the police. I should have made the call myself. I should have drawn a line, sharp and clean, between right and wrong. But instead, I moved. I moved without speaking, without questioning, without hesitation. I handed him a clean towel and pointed to the bathroom. I put his bloodied shirt into a trash bag and tied it tight. I wiped the spots he'd tracked across my floor. My body worked faster than my brain, following some instinct I didn't know I had. An instinct not to help, but to protect. After he'd showered, he handed me a small object wrapped in a t-shirt. I knew better than to unwrap it. I carried it out to my car, drove across the bridge to the east side of the city, and threw it into the river. My hands shook on the wheel, but I didn't turn back. Back at my apartment, I scrubbed the sink until my knuckles burned. I washed my hands over and over, long after the blood was gone. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, waiting to see a different face, but it was still mine, still calm, still composed. I told myself he hadn't done it, that it wasn't murder, that he had been scared, that anyone would have helped, that it was loyalty, that it was love. I told myself lies because the truth was beginning to take shape in the corner of my mind, and it terrified me. The next day, the story broke on the news. A man had been found behind a motel near the freeway, stabbed. No suspects, no witnesses, just a name. I didn't recognize it, and that made it easier to breathe. I convinced myself the man had been dangerous, that Jason had only defended himself, that it was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew in silence. Jason stayed with me for 3 nights. He barely ate. He barely slept. He sat by the window and smoked cigarettes down to the filter. Sometimes I caught him watching me, like he couldn't quite figure out why I had helped him. I couldn't either. I kept expecting the knock to come, the police, the detectives, the questions. But it didn't. Days passed, and life pressed on, ordinary and oblivious. I went to work. I checked vitals and updated charts and changed dressings. No one saw it on me. No one suspected the storm beneath my skin. I had become 2 people, one who saved lives by day and one who had buried a piece of the truth under water and silence. Then he left, no warning, just gone. His side of the bed cold, his toothbrush still in the cup, no note, no goodbye, just absence. I sat in the middle of my apartment and stared at the door, realizing too late that he had taken more than he left behind. In the weeks that followed, I waited for peace to return, for the line I had crossed to blur back into nothing. But it didn't. I saw his face in crowds. I heard his voice in dreams. And every time I passed the river, I felt it. What I had done, what I had destroyed, what I had become. I wasn't a killer, but I had touched the edge of something irreversible. And no matter how clean my hands looked, I knew what they had held. I had chosen silence. I had chosen loyalty. I had chosen him. And in doing so, I had lost myself. I didn't kill him, but I helped bury the truth. And that truth, I realized, doesn't stay buried for long. It breathes beneath the surface. It waits. And one day, it comes back. The world didn't change all at once. It shifted gradually, like the way sunlight fades before a storm, slow enough that you almost believe it's still the same day, until you look up and realize you've stepped into another sky entirely. That's how it began for me. A shift I couldn't name at first. A crack in the glass of my reality. In the weeks after Jason disappeared, time lost its rhythm. I moved through the hours like someone underwater, each moment slowed, muffled, heavy. My body performed the mechanics of daily life, but my mind hovered somewhere behind my eyes, watching, calculating, bracing. I kept going to work, kept answering phone calls, kept paying bills. I smiled when I had to. I nodded in meetings, but nothing felt real anymore. My apartment, once my sanctuary, became something else, a museum of what I used to be. The couch where he had sat, the door he walked through, the towel I had handed him, Objects became witnesses. Walls whispered. I couldn't rest. I couldn't breathe fully. I was always listening for footsteps in the hallway, for the sudden knock I now feared with every cell in my body. When the detectives finally came, it was almost a relief. They didn't storm in. They didn't wear uniforms. Just plain clothes, polite voices, business cards placed carefully on my kitchen counter. They said they were following up. Standard procedure. I invited them in, like a woman with nothing to hide. My hands didn't tremble, but they felt far away, like they belonged to someone else. They asked questions. Had I seen Jason recently? Did I know where he might be? Had he ever talked to me about the victim? I gave them the version of the truth I'd practiced. He had visited briefly. No, he hadn't seemed upset. No, we hadn't talked about anything serious. Just catching up. Old friends. I kept my voice steady, my eyes open. I imagined myself on a hospital shift, giving a report on a patient. Factual, controlled, safe. They didn't push. They thanked me, said they might be in touch again. One of them smiled as he left, as if we had shared something familiar. I closed the door and locked it. Then I sank to the floor and pressed my forehead against the cool wood, holding my breath until the edges of my vision darkened. That was when the second life began, the one beneath the surface, the one where I no longer trusted time or space or memory. I became a woman split down the center, one half visible, functional, even competent, the other hidden, unraveling, watching shadows move. I started to avoid mirrors, not because I feared what I would see, but because I feared what I wouldn't. My reflection didn't look guilty. It didn't look afraid. It looked like me, and that was the most terrifying part. How easily I had become someone who could lie to police, who could erase a man's death from her lips. I hadn't changed on the outside, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. At the clinic, I found myself staring too long at patients, wondering what they were hiding, what invisible burdens they carried. I became hypersensitive to tone, to pauses, to eye contact. I started reading people like case notes, dissecting every word for meaning. It was exhausting, but I couldn't stop. If I had missed something in Jason, what else was I blind to? Sleep became a negotiation. When I managed to drift off, my dreams twisted into scenes I didn't recognize. Endless corridors, blood in the sink, phones that rang but never connected. I woke up tangled in sheets, gasping, drenched in sweat. I stopped talking to my mother. I stopped answering messages from coworkers who wanted to get drinks after shifts. I stopped living in the version of the world everyone else still believed in. I began to walk at night, long, aimless loops through neighborhoods I didn't know. I craved anonymity, motion, the illusion of distance. I told myself it cleared my head, but really I was searching. For him, for answers, for some kind of sign that I hadn't completely lost my place in the narrative of my own life. One night, walking past a gas station, I caught a glimpse of a news report playing inside. The headline caught my eye. Victim had history of violence, police say. I stopped and watched through the window. The screen showed a photo of the dead man. He looked ordinary, unremarkable. Then they showed the alley where he was found. Yellow tape, a white sheet, an officer taking notes in the background. I couldn't move. The world tilted slightly, like I'd stepped onto a boat I hadn't noticed. I didn't go home that night. I sat on a bench near the river until the sky began to pale, watching the water move like something alive and indifferent. Somewhere beneath it lay the object I had thrown. I imagined it shifting slowly with the current, resting against rocks and silt, still carrying the truth I'd tried to erase. My face changed after that. Not in the way most people would notice, but enough that I did. The lines deepened. The corners of my mouth tightened. My eyes lost something. I couldn't name what, only that it had been important. Some light, some softness. I started carrying guilt like a second skin, not constant, but always close, brushing against me in the quiet moments, in the pause between heartbeats, in the click of a door latch, in the way people said my name and waited as if I might not answer. Then the second death happened. It wasn't connected at first. Different part of the city, different method, different victim. But something in my bones knew before the news confirmed it. Jason. He had done it again. The truth was no longer a question. It was a pattern. It was a scream buried inside silence. And with it came the knowledge that I hadn't just crossed a line. I had burned the map behind me. I hadn't protected an innocent man. I had shielded a predator. And now another person was dead. I couldn't speak. I couldn't cry. I sat on the floor of my shower, fully clothed, the water pounding down like penance, and tried to understand how I had gotten there. What part of me had believed the first lie? What part had decided my loyalty was more valuable than someone's life? The universe I now lived in had different rules, different gravity. Here, justice was abstract. Here, the past followed you like a shadow. Here, the truth didn't set you free. It just changed your cage. I stopped walking at night. I stopped watching the news. I started counting time in breaths, in hours without nausea, in mornings where I could look out the window without flinching. My life had become a performance I no longer believed in, and beneath it all, something waited. A reckoning, a return, the moment when everything I had hidden would surface. And when it did, I knew I would no longer be the woman who crossed the line. I would be the woman who disappeared behind it. It began on a night that felt heavier than it should have. The air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and burned oil, and the city hummed with that low, restless energy that comes when something is about to break. I was driving with the windows cracked, the rain whispering against the glass, when I saw the lights in my rearview mirror, blue, distant, pulsing like a heartbeat. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But I gripped the wheel tighter anyway. Fear no longer needed reason. It lived in me like an organ. I turned onto a side street and kept driving until the lights disappeared. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking. My apartment felt different, as if someone had rearranged the air inside. I noticed small things, the way the shadows fell across the floor, the faint smell of cigarettes that shouldn't have been there, the imprint on the arm of the couch. My first thought wasn't that someone had broken in. It was that he was back. And in a way, he was. There was a letter on the counter. No envelope, just a sheet of lined paper, folded twice. My name written in handwriting I knew too well. Sharp, deliberate, familiar. I read it standing up, my pulse ticking in my throat. He said he needed help again, that things had gone wrong, that he had no one else to turn to. He told me not to call anyone. He told me to meet him where it had started. The message was short, almost tender in its simplicity. And in those few lines, my entire life tilted. I could have ignored it. I could have gone to the police, or burned the note, or simply left the city that night. But I didn't. I folded it neatly, put it in my pocket, and sat at the edge of my bed until dawn. By morning, I had already made my choice. The place he meant was an abandoned parking lot behind a strip mall on the south side. It used to be a diner when we were younger, a place where we'd waste hours drinking coffee, talking about nothing, pretending the world was waiting for us. Now it was nothing but cracked asphalt and weeds pushing through the concrete. He was already there when I arrived, leaning against the hood of a car that wasn't his. He looked older, thinner, the kind of tired that comes from running too long. His eyes found me, and for a moment I saw the boy I used to know flicker inside the man he'd become. Then it was gone. He told me there had been another fight, another accident, he called it. The word hung between us like a lie we both recognized but couldn't say out loud. He needed to get rid of something. He needed my help. His voice trembled, not from guilt, but from panic. I felt the old instinct rise again, the one that had destroyed me once already, the one that confused compassion with complicity. I followed him, not because I believed him this time, but because I needed to see it for myself. We drove down a long stretch of road, the kind that seemed to lead nowhere. When he stopped, the world was silent except for the ticking of the engine. He opened the trunk. Inside was a gun wrapped in a towel, stained dark. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. I remember standing there, staring at that piece of metal, realizing that everything in me was fighting two truths at once: the truth that I could still save him, and the truth that saving him meant losing myself completely. My hands moved before my mind caught up. I grabbed the towel, wrapped it tighter, and took it from him. The gesture was automatic, almost merciful. It was also my undoing. We drove to the river, the same river that had swallowed my first sin, the same place I had come to when I thought I could bury the past. The water was higher now, faster. The moon hung low, indifferent, watching. I stood at the edge and felt the weight in my hands. My reflection on the surface looked like a stranger's, someone capable of anything, someone who had already crossed too many lines to find her way back. I dropped the towel. It sank without sound. He thanked me, not with words, but with the hollow look of a man who knew he had taken too much. He touched my arm as if it were a confession. I wanted to pull away, to scream, to tell him that I was done, that I couldn't carry his ghosts anymore. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked back to the car. My feet felt heavy, as if the ground itself resisted me. When I got home that night, I sat in the dark and waited for sirens, for knocking, for the inevitable. None came, just silence, the kind that seeps into your bones and whispers that you've gone too far. I realized then that I had crossed the point where fear ends and numbness begins. It wasn't relief, it was resignation. The days that followed blurred together. The city carried on, oblivious. I went to work, pretending to care about things that no longer mattered. I treated patients, charted symptoms, filled prescriptions. My coworkers smiled at me, and I smiled back. None of them saw it. The quiet fracture beneath the surface, the constant hum of dread. Nights were worse. The dreams were different now, not chaotic, but precise. I saw the river again and again, the towel unfolding beneath the current, the water blooming red. Then one morning, I saw his face on the news. Not Jason's, but the man he had killed. They called it a homicide. They said the suspect was still at large. I turned off the television and sat in silence. The coffee on the table went cold. There was no shock this time, no disbelief, only a cold, heavy certainty. It was done. The truth was no longer something I could hide behind. It was coming for me, slow but inevitable, like the tide returning to shore. A week later, they found him. Not alive. The report said overdose, but I knew better. It wasn't escape. It was surrender. He had always been running, from guilt, from justice, from himself, and now he had found the only way to stop. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I felt only a strange emptiness, as if the universe had finally balanced the scales and left me hollow in the process. The police came again, this time with real questions, real evidence. They had found my fingerprints on something they shouldn't have. They asked where I had been that night, who I had seen, why I had gone to the river. I told them lies that didn't even sound convincing anymore. They didn't need to press hard. I was already unraveling. The truth lived under my skin, burning. When they finally placed the cuffs on my wrists, I felt a rush of something almost like relief. As they drove me away, I looked out the window at the city, its lights, its quiet streets, its indifferent sprawl. It looked unchanged, but I knew I would never see it the same again. There are moments in life when the road splits so completely that you can never find your way back. That night by the river was mine. That was where I crossed the threshold from who I thought I was into who I truly became. The point of no return wasn't a moment. It was a choice disguised as mercy, a single act dressed in the illusion of love. I thought I was helping someone I cared for, but all I did was trade one kind of death for another. And as the car carried me through the empty streets, the city lights flashing across my face, I understood that every step I had taken had been leading here, to this silence, to this reckoning, to this final irreversible place where the truth could no longer drown. It was not the metal bars or the clanging doors that broke me. It wasn't the routine of roll calls or the sterile taste of powdered eggs or the itch of the uniform against my skin. It was the silence between things, the hours that stretched endlessly between count and chow, between dusk and sleep, between one breath and the next. It was in that silence that I met the version of myself I had spent a lifetime avoiding. My first months inside the prison walls passed like a slow drip, days stacked like dull stones. The rhythms of incarceration were relentless and circular, mornings announced by fluorescent lights that buzzed with the same cold indifference as the guards, nights stitched with the sound of distant coughing, murmured prayers, and the occasional cry that cut through the dark like a blade. I learned quickly that no one asked what you were in for unless they already knew, and that the more silent you stayed, the safer you remained. I was not the loud one, not the fighter, not the inmate with the hardened eyes and sharpened tongue. I was the observer. I moved with caution, I listened more than I spoke, and I kept to myself. That made me invisible, and in prison, invisibility was its own kind of survival. But even invisibility couldn't shield me from the truth that throbbed beneath everything. It pulsed in the floor, in the walls, in my chest. I had buried a life. I had stood at the edge of a river and thrown away more than a weapon. I had surrendered to the illusion of loyalty, and now sat among the punished, slowly learning what the word consequence truly meant. Some nights I wondered if this was what I deserved, not just confinement, but erasure, to be forgotten by the world I once belonged to. My mother's letters came less frequently. Friends faded like old Polaroids, their outlines blurring into silence. No one said goodbye. No one had to. Their absence said it all. I had made my choice. I had picked my side, and now I belonged to this place. But the human heart is stubborn. Even surrounded by concrete and razor wire, it looks for light. It reaches blindly in the dark. And eventually, something reached back. Her name was Linda. She was older than most of us, with a face carved deep by time and survival. She ran the prison library, a glorified broom closet with warped shelves and more romance novels than anything else. But to her, it was a kingdom. She didn't talk much, but she noticed things. When I lingered near the bookshelves, touching spines without pulling anything down. She called me over without looking up from her catalog. "Start with Baldwin," she said, sliding a paperback across the table. It was The Fire Next Time. I read it in 2 days. When I returned it, she handed me another. Then another. She never asked what I thought, never quizzed me, just kept the books coming. And I devoured them. For the first time in months, my mind had somewhere to go. A world beyond gray walls and guilt, characters with broken pasts and beating hearts, language that carved into my chest like a chisel. Through those stories, I found a way to speak again, even if only to myself. Eventually, Linda started letting me help in the library, a few hours each week, organizing returns, repairing bindings, entering titles into the battered computer. It was nothing, and it was everything. It gave shape to my time. It gave me a task that wasn't about penance, but participation. It reminded me that I still had the capacity to give something, even if it was small. Even if it was just a book placed into the hands of a woman who hadn't been called by her first name in years. In that quiet room, with its flickering overhead light and its faint scent of dust and glue, I began to heal in increments too small to measure. I started writing in the margins of the books I read, tiny notes, questions, underlined passages that echoed in my bones. I began keeping a notebook, scribbling thoughts in a shaky hand that had once charted medical vitals and now documented pain, hope, fragments of memory. I wrote about the river. I wrote about Jason. I wrote about the moment the truth slipped from my grasp and became a shadow that followed me everywhere. I didn't write to forgive myself. I wasn't ready for that. I wrote because the silence was killing me and words were the only air I had left. Then came the program. They called it Second Chances, a mentorship initiative for inmates close to parole eligibility. It was voluntary. I hesitated. I didn't think I had anything to offer. But Linda pushed the form across the table and said, "Somebody needs to hear your voice." So I signed it. My mentee was a 23-year-old named Brielle. She had been inside since she was 18, drugs, theft, probation violations. A baby with fire in her eyes and anger too large for her frame. She sat across from me like she was ready to bolt. I recognized that posture. I had worn it once, but slowly, over weeks of awkward meetings and quiet conversations, something softened between us. She started asking questions about books, about life outside, about how to stop making the same choices. I didn't have answers, but I told her the truth. I told her that the first time you betray yourself, it feels like necessity. The second time, it feels like habit. And after that, it stops feeling at all. I told her not to trust the silence that tells you you're fine when you're not. I told her about the light and how long it takes to see it again. And in doing so, I began to see it myself. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't salvation. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was slow and unglamorous and deeply human. It was a girl trusting me enough to cry in front of me. It was a thank you note slipped under my door in the middle of the night. It was a stack of returned books, each with a passage circled in pencil. It was the realization that even in a place designed to break us, we were still finding ways to rebuild. One morning, I was called into the warden's office. He told me I'd been granted a parole hearing, 6 months early. I nodded, too stunned to speak. The weight of that moment didn't hit me until I returned to my cell and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, not at the drawings or the tally marks or the taped-up photograph of a lake I'd never been to, but at the blank space next to it. The space that had always felt like a sentence now felt like a question. What would I do with freedom? Not the freedom of open doors, but the kind that came from facing the wreckage without running. the kind that demanded you build something out of the ruins. I didn't know yet, but for the first time, I wanted to try. I wanted to step toward the light, not to forget the tunnel, but to honor the fact that I had walked through it and survived. And somewhere deep inside me, something whispered, not absolution, not permission, but possibility. A life beyond the bars, a life I would have to earn every day. The morning I was released, the sky looked too big. It stretched above the prison like a mouth yawning open, blue and merciless. I stood on the edge of the parking lot in borrowed jeans and a second-hand coat, holding a plastic bag that contained everything I owned now: 2 books, a notebook filled with shaky handwriting, a pair of shoes, and a letter from a girl named Brielle who told me I had saved her life. My own felt less certain. No one came to meet me. I hadn't asked. I didn't want the weight of expectations or the awkwardness of long silences. I didn't want to see pity in my mother's eyes or hear my sister lie through her teeth, pretending she still believed in me. It was easier to leave alone. The bus came late. I sat on a bench next to a vending machine that had long since stopped working and tried to remember the last time I had seen the world move without bars between us. Even the wind felt different, freer but colder. The driver barely looked at me when I climbed aboard. I chose a seat near the back, pressed my forehead to the window, and watched the prison grow smaller until it disappeared. The landscape that passed outside was familiar but distorted. Gas stations, strip malls, roads I used to know, but everything had shifted in my absence. Time had moved forward and I hadn't. I was still the woman who had made a choice by the river, still the woman who had tried to save someone who could not be saved, still the woman who had lied. I found a room above a dry cleaner's in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. The walls were thin, the heat unpredictable, but it was mine. I scrubbed the floor on my knees, not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to cleanse. I made my bed with military precision every morning. I hung a calendar on the wall and crossed off each day with a red marker. A ritual. Proof that I was still here. The parole officer assigned to me was polite but distant. She gave me a list of rules and a folder of pamphlets. She said things like second chance and productive re-entry, but her eyes held the same cautious calculation I had come to recognize in everyone. People didn't see you anymore. They saw what you had done. You became a shadow version of yourself, a warning, a whispered story told across dinner tables, and no matter how quietly you lived, that shadow followed. Finding work was harder than I'd expected. I submitted dozens of applications: retail, food service, warehouses. No one called. When they did, the moment they asked about my past, I saw the wall go up. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain. I got a job cleaning offices at night. The pay was low, but the solitude suited me. No one watched me mop the floors. No one asked why I never spoke. I walked everywhere. I couldn't afford a car, and I didn't trust myself behind the wheel anymore. The rhythm of my steps was meditative. I counted cracks in the sidewalk, read signs in store windows, memorized street names like verses in a prayer. I passed people laughing on patios, couples arguing on corners, teenagers scrolling through their phones as if the world would never end. I didn't envy them. I didn't judge. I just watched, invisible as ever. Every Sunday, I went to the library. It smelled like old paper and fluorescent dust. I sat in the farthest corner, away from the computers and the children's section, and read anything that didn't remind me of myself. Fiction, mostly. Stories of other women in other countries, in other times, who survived things I could barely imagine. I didn't write anymore. I wasn't sure what I would say. but I underlined passages in books, folded corners, made notes in the margins, as if those voices could anchor me to something more human. I saw Brielle once. She found me outside the library, called my name like it still belonged to me. She looked older, steadier, her anger replaced by something quieter. She said she had found work at a shelter. She hugged me before I could react. I didn't know what to do with that warmth. It lingered on my clothes long after she left. Some nights I still dreamed of the river. But it had changed. The water was calmer now, less cruel. Sometimes I stood at the edge. Sometimes I walked in. And once, just once, I saw myself on the other side, whole and waiting. I woke up crying, not from sadness, but from something like hope, a weak, flickering thing, but real. Freedom was not what they promised. It was not the opposite of a cell. It was a different kind of confinement, a life lived under scrutiny, under silence, under the weight of what can never be undone. It was paying for your crimes in ways no sentence could measure. It was returning to a world that moved on without you and learning to walk through it as someone else. But even within that cage, there were slivers of light. In the smell of bread from the corner bakery, in the quiet shuffle of pages in the library, in the unexpected kindness of a stranger who held the door, in the way my body no longer tensed at every siren, in the space between guilt and forgiveness where I began to rebuild. I did not expect redemption. I did not seek forgiveness, but I wanted to be useful. I wanted to exist without erasing myself. And some days, that was enough. One morning, months after my release, I stood at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change. The street was empty. The sky was soft with clouds. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The world didn't stop. No one turned to stare. Nothing crumbled beneath my feet. But something shifted. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking through someone else's life. For the first time, I felt free and frightened and alive.